Welcome to the 5-2 Diet podcast. All the tips and information you need to lose weight and feel great with intermittent fasting. I'm Kate Harrison from the 52dietbook.com. I've lost 31 pounds, that's 14 kilograms, and it's transformed how I eat and how I feel. I've written 4 books about 5-2, I run one of the largest 5-2 groups on the web, and I still fast every week. It's easy, flexible and free. This podcast will help you 5-2. Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm talking about food, one of my favourite things. More specifically, we're talking about what to eat on a fast day. I'm going to be running you through the heroes and villains of fast day food, talking about dolls' house meals and discussing whether carbs are the enemy. Also chatting a bit about homemade versus ready prepared meals, and I'll be answering your questions about food on fast days. Plus, a question for you. Have you joined the cult of the cauliflower? Be very afraid. First of all, the story of the girl who burned the beans. I want to tell you today about how I went from being the kind of pupil who terrified cookery teachers to someone who really loves food and has, incredibly to me, even now, written 2 recipe books. I'm sharing it because I think if I can learn to cook, then so can anyone. Domestic science, home economics, call it what you will. Actually, it was called home economics when I was at school, and they'd only just, incredibly, started teaching it to boys. Now, I like to bake at home with my mum and my grandmother. We used to make lemon meringue pies and also Eccles cakes, which is a Lancastrian kind of pastry where you put lots and lots of currants, lots of butter, lots of sugar and pastry. Absolutely delicious. But I didn't really cook normal standard meals, and in school it was very much about British solid cuisine, meat and 2 veg, sausage rolls, pies and the rest of it. I just wasn't interested and I was extremely ill prepared. So for example, one day we were meant to be making jam tarts. I forgot to ask my mum about the ingredients. All we could find was those little tiny pots that you get, and you used to steal them from hotels. And so I ended up with this massive jam tart with a tiny little splodge of jam in the middle. That wasn't the worst, to be honest. I also managed, when we made a great English breakfast, to not only make the sausages almost set on fire, but also to burn the baked beans in the saucepan. So you can see that I wasn't a great prospect for a cook. I gave up cooking in school when I was 13, and it was a huge relief to my cookery teacher, I could tell. Fast forward 5 years to when I left home and was cooking in a student kitchen for the first time. I actually became a vegetarian at this point as well, partly because I met some cool people who were vegetarians. I was very easily influenced. Also partly because when I tried cooking with meat, I just found it really strange. I was an animal lover as well, and about 20 years ago, it was much, much harder to find good foods with high welfare standards for meat. So the more I read about it, the more I thought, actually, I don't really want meat to be part of my diet at that point. So I began cooking with vegetables, easy things to start off with, but things I liked. So cauliflower cheese was one of my early experiments. Bought a few cookbooks. And I also used to have my party trick dish, which was a baked avocado, because it's a nice one to try, actually. If you just take the stone out and then put something in the middle where the stone used to be, like a filling, cream cheese or something, cheese on the top or some nuts, and bake it for about 10 minutes or so, it goes really, really soft and delicious, like a kind of a pate, and that was my dinner party cool dish as a student. So from being a really reluctant cook, I began to turn it into a bit of a hobby. I bought recipe books and I did a few evening classes as well. I learned to bake my own bread and even did a course in Spain about cooking with chocolate. The downside, of course, to all this cooking was the things I love to make made me fat. And I tried all sorts of diets and they didn't work, or I'd put the weight back on again. I did try low carbing, but that meant I couldn't eat all of those delicious cakey things, so that was out. Then I started 5-2. And you can hear more about my intermittent fasting journey in podcast 1. But I didn't talk then much about food, and To begin with, despite being a real keen cook, I used to rely more on ready meals because I think I was nervous that if I spent too much time in the kitchen, I might be tempted to eat the wrong things or cook the wrong things. So I went out of my way to try and find healthy ready meals, and there are good ones out there with not too many additives and ingredients that you'd recognise. But I realised pretty quickly that I was missing a trick, really. If I liked cooking, why not turn my fast days into a bit of a challenge to get the maximum flavour for the minimum calories? And we started sharing recipes on the Facebook group I set up, and after writing my first 5-2 book, I set about writing a cookbook. And now I have two, the ultimate 5-2 recipe book and the 5-2 Good Food Kitchen, which has just come out this January in 2015. I'll talk a bit about what I've learned about the food later, but first of all, let's tackle that ready meal thing. Ready meals versus homemade. There are plenty of pros about pre-packaged, pre-prepared foods, and I'm talking here particularly about the ones that you get in the fridge in the supermarket. They tend to be very quick, they tend to be calorie counted already, so all that work is done for you. The downsides is that they can be more expensive than making your own, especially if when you make your own, you're actually batch cooking, putting stuff in the freezer so you've got your own ready meal. The other thing with ready meals is that although some are very similar in ingredients to what you get at home, a lot of them have ingredients and additives in them that I don't either understand or particularly want to eat. I remember going into Poundland, the discount store here in the UK, and they often have a whole range of diet foods. And those are particularly bad often because when you turn over the packaging, I remember something, it was like a lemon snack biscuit. And I think the only ingredient there I recognised was lemon. And even that was a kind of essence of lemon. It wasn't fresh lemons at all. The rest, honestly, it looked more like a science experiment than something you'd want to eat. And this brings me to compromises when it comes to ready meals, because I think they are useful for people if you're in a hurry. Look at the ingredients really closely, and if it's something you don't recognise or you don't think your granny would have recognised, and my granny certainly wouldn't have recognised the stuff in these lemon cake things, put it to one side. The other thing to say about convenience or ready meal foods is don't overlook the less glamorous ones, and by which I mean frozen foods and tinned foods. They tend to be cheaper and they really aren't as glamorous because these are old style ways of preserving and presenting food. But things like a tin of baked beans, frozen peas, frozen spinach, frozen white fish like cod, either in a sauce or just as it comes, they can be really useful for fast day foods, and they're often picked when, in the case of produce, vegetables, when the vitamin content is pretty high, and there's lots of research that shows that that is well preserved by freezing. You can even get some really quite unusual things that you wouldn't have expected but are really useful. So I tried the other day frozen butternut squash chunks. I'm a bit dangerous occasionally in the kitchen, and the number of times I've tried chopping a butternut squash and almost chopped off a finger at the same time because they're really difficult to do. The squash, perfectly acceptable in an awful lot of dishes, and cheaper I'd say too. Grilled peppers, another really delicious thing. They cook up very quickly and give a nice Mediterranean flavour to food. So I'm a bit of a fan of homemade dishes, and what I would say is that you can make them cheaper. It can be just as easy to cook a batch meal that you've had in the freezer or in the fridge. You can prepare those very quickly in the same way as any other ready meal, stick them in the oven when you get home from work. Of course, you also get to control exactly what goes into the food, so if there's an ingredient you don't like garlic, which seems to get into absolutely everything, there's also a benefit if you are regularly cooking for other people, including your family, in that you can serve up pretty much the same meal, but you know just to have a slightly smaller portion size, or perhaps serve a few less chips, that kind of thing. And that way it won't be as obvious, especially to younger members of the family, that you're dieting, because you won't be sitting there with a little black plastic dish of something that looks and smells not entirely like food. I'm going to talk portion sizes now, because we were just speaking about the little tiny dishes that you tend to get in ready meals. And I would say that the simplest way to eat on a fast day is to have what I call doll's house meals. So if you've listened to podcast 2, I talk about what exactly I ate on my first fast day. And it was a mini version of the breakfast I usually have, which is yogurt and raspberries. Well, I should say the breakfast I usually used to have, because I've completely changed my habits since 5-2 when it comes to breakfast. More of that in a second. But the doll's house meal is just what you normally have, but shrunk. It's a smaller portion on a smaller plate, and there's psychological research that shows that if you eat off a smaller plate, you probably won't notice it that much smaller. You'll be satisfied sooner. Nicely presented, sit down to eat it, but you're just consuming fewer calories because you're having less food. I said I'd come on to the breakfast issue, and this brings me to my first question. The question comes from Kerry, who lives in Brisbane in Australia and is also a member of our 5-2 Facebook group. And she asked, do I really have to eat breakfast? I'm very rarely hungry in the mornings, and yet everyone keeps badgering me and saying that I have to have it or I won't lose weight. Is this true? That is such a good question, and the answer might surprise you because we're told all the time that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Heard it so many times, and I used to think it was true as well. Actually, it is not true that losing weight is impossible if you skip breakfast. I'm going to do a whole podcast about meal timing and gaps between meals in the future, but I won't keep you waiting, Kerry, that wouldn't be fair. The truth is that an awful lot of the research about breakfast is sponsored by breakfast cereal companies. That's point one. Point two is that a lot of the research that shows it's a problem for people is carried out on people who are used to having breakfast. So you know what it's like if you've made any kind of dietary change. It does affect things like your concentration and your energy until you get used to it. There are some groups where breakfast does seem to have some big benefits, and those are children and teenagers, and it seems that their concentration at school is better if they've had some breakfast. The critical thing as well is what you have for breakfast. So breakfast cereals, especially the ones with added sugar, yes, you might have a bit of energy at the time, but it's likely that that will come crashing down a bit later. Those are possibly the worst things that you could have. Things like eggs, say with something like spinach and salmon or ham, those can be really, really good. And in fact, they can be quite good on a fast day if you are the kind of person who likes breakfast. And if you enjoy breakfast and it works for you, then carry on. But the whole point about 5-2 is that we're challenging convention with this way of eating anyway. So why not experiment? And if you don't like breakfast, see if that works better for you on a fast day. Personally, I've found that the later I leave eating, whether that's lunchtime or supper time, the less hungry I feel. Whereas when I ate breakfast, I would find that the hunger pangs would be stronger. And I know that that's been the experience of an awful lot of people in our group who now tend to eat either lunch and an evening meal or no lunch and just the evening meal. And some take breakfast and then have a gap until dinner time. So it's entirely up to you, but it won't in itself stop you losing weight. As I say, I will go into this in a lot more detail in a future podcast. That does lead me on from the whole breakfast debate into the carbs question. Carbohydrates, the serial killer on your plate, or just misunderstood? Even Al Capone gets better PR than carbohydrates these days. It's all no carb, low carb, sugar-free, quitting sugar. The whole quitting sugar thing is really big in the UK this year. That's 2015. And I know when I visited Australia last year, it was a big thing too. I'm going to do a whole podcast about food groups and balance in the future, but for now I want to look at the real basics. Food can only be made up of one of three macronutrients. That's carbohydrate, protein or fat, or a mixture of those. Now, carbohydrates are everywhere, and I think one of the things people don't always understand is that they're not just the demon sugar or white bread or white pasta. Those are the so-called simple carbohydrates, and they do give you a quick or simple energy hit. But most vegetables or fruit are carbohydrates too, not surprisingly, because this is the way that plants store their energy. And when people talk about avoiding carbohydrates, that doesn't normally mean that they're giving carrots or tomatoes or lettuce a miss. On a fast day or any other day when you're trying to keep the calorie count, the energy count a little bit low, it's true that simple carbohydrates, white bread, sugary donuts, chocolate, are going to be a bit of a double whammy. They've got high calorie content, and though they give you that energy hit, there's a lot of evidence that your body will deal with the sugar that comes into your bloodstream really quickly, and then it will give you hunger pangs, and you will feel hungrier sooner, and therefore you're more likely to grab something else, probably more sugar, more carbohydrate, and ruin your fast. But there is a reason that sweet things taste nice to us. They are energy dense. And back in the olden days, we did need those energy bursts, though the body made us want them when they were there. It's the same with fatty foods, which are even more calorie dense, but they're delicious. And they also add that texture, that mouthfeel from a delicious oily dressing, or butter if you're using butter to cook with. I think this is why 5-2 really works, because it's as much a strategy as a diet. It's helping you to make good choices without banning stuff. Because if I said to you, well, you can never eat butter or carbohydrates or all of those things that a lot of diets do say you can't eat again, if I say you can't have those ever again, you start to crave them. What I'm talking about today is how we can reduce the cravings immediately on the fast day, so you stick to that low calorie limit. The next podcast is going to be a little bit more about how you adopt fairly healthy eating, but still with some treats the rest of your life. But on the fast day, certainly avoiding the simple carbs is a good idea, but there are lots of other carbohydrates, things like beans and other grains, barley, oats, which can be really useful. I'm actually going to come to my next question now, which comes from Holly Jane in Shropshire in the UK. And she says, do you think the amount of carbs, bad fats or sugar you have within your 500 calories on a fast day affects your weight loss? Or can you literally have 500 calories of anything and still lose the same? It's a really good question, and it comes down to that even simpler question of whether a calorie is a calorie, whatever form you take it in. There's, as usual, a complicated answer and a simple answer. The simple answer is that in theory, if you eat the 500 calories on the fast day and you are eating a normal amount the rest of the time, then you should still lose weight, whatever it is you're eating. The reality, I think, is that there are two other issues to bear in mind. One is, on a fast day, it really is about making your meals as satisfying as possible, and those simple carbohydrates and certainly really sugary foods are unlikely to satisfy you for long because we digest them so quickly. So on a fast day, it does make a lot more sense to focus on vegetables and proteins, which keep you full for longer. Good proteins to go for are the ones which aren't too high in fat. White fish, chicken, especially chicken breasts, things like eggs. Vegetable proteins are not as protein dense, but they are pretty good in other ways, so they fill you up, things like pulses, beans, alongside some of the more complicated carbohydrates. These are the ones that take you a bit longer to digest. They're starchy, yes, but they have got extra nutrients and they take the body a bit longer to break them down. And if you can, within your calorie count, then a little bit of fat, half a teaspoon of butter or a little bit of oil can also make the meal more tasty, but in addition help you absorb some of the nutrients, because the nutrients are the other issue that I was talking about here. The trouble with the simple carbohydrates is that they've been so heavily refined that you lose a lot of the nutrients, the micronutrients, things like vitamins and minerals that were in the original plant but disappear by the time you've ground them up. And there's a bit of a rule of thumb that says when it comes to grains and things like that, if they're white, they look a bit bleached, includes bread and pasta and things like that. They've probably been refined and a lot of the nutrients have gone. Whereas if they're browner, that shows that the whole grain is still there, and that's where an awful lot of those essential vitamins are still found. There's an awful lot more about this in the 5-2 Good Food Kitchen because it's a real passion of mine. It doesn't have to be complicated, but on a fast day, focus on green vegetables, maybe some berries if you want a bit of sweetness, and some good quality protein from eggs, beans, fish. So what is actually on the menu on a fast day? A lot of theory there, I know, so I thought I would explain to you what kind of things you might get for your 500 calories on a fast day if you're a woman, or your 600 if you're a man. And this is taken from some of the recipes that I've developed for my books. So, for example, if you like 3 meals a day, if you're female, For 485 calories, for breakfast you'd get a Black Forest yogurt drink, which is 92 calories. That's really delicious. Cherries and cocoa powder give it a slight chocolatey kick. Lunch, romaine tacos with fresh sprouts, avocado and cheese, 122 calories. I really like these, especially in the summer. And for dinner, crunchy chicken salad with parmesan and mustard dressing. That's 271 calories. Men, they get about another 100 calories to play with. So in this example, 583 calories. For the total, for breakfast, you get 2 cheddar and apple ploughman's brunch mini muffins. Lunch, smoked mackerel with crisp vegetable remoulade. And for dinner, polenta triangles with a rich sausage ragout. All of that for 483 calories. If you are more of a lunch and dinner kind of person, this is really what I am, then again for women, around 500 calories. For lunch you'll get imam bayildi, one of my favourite veggie dishes, rich stuffed aubergines. That's about 200 calories, lots and lots of sweet and sour flavours in that, and you can prepare it in advance. And for dinner, homemade pizza with a cauliflower base and blue cheese topping. For men, a few more calories to play with. So for lunch, we've got a real crowd pleaser, Tex-Mex beef salad, 246 calories. And for dinner, Asian spiced fish parcels with fennel, onion and celery. That's 374 calories, and that includes some basmati rice on the side, and that adds up to 620 calories. Finally, you have got the option of one really hearty main meal, and you'd be surprised. So for women, this one actually comes a little bit under at 463 calories. You've got a speedy Virgin Mary soup. You can actually have a Bloody Mary option for that on non-fasting days. Main course, lemongrass and ginger pork with noodles. And even a dessert, spiced raspberry and apple yoghurt ice. For men, we've got a starter, a freshly minted green soup with goat's cheese floats. I have to say that is probably my favourite recipe that I've developed recently. For the main course, indulgent salmon and gnocchi bake. Really doesn't feel like a fast day dinner or diet food in any way. And for dessert, whipped vanilla mousse with red fruit ripple. It's time for my third and final question, which is from Kate in Halifax, West Yorkshire in the UK. And she says, I'm usually good on fast days till the evening. Then I feel the urge to munch on anything. How can I stop? Again, it's something that's probably familiar to all of us. My own kind of low period tends to be about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The principles, though, of dealing with this are the same. Keep busy and have an emergency but fast-friendly snack available, because it's an awful lot better than going to the fridge and just snaffling whatever's there. The thing about meal timing that I was talking about before, I've definitely found that if you can leave eating as late as possible, that will really help, because then it means you're getting a really satisfying meal, perhaps in the early evening, and you're less likely to feel hungry. Often that hunger, especially in the evening, is to do with boredom. So if you find a distraction, it might be a hobby, it might be a book, going on the Facebook group to swap some stories from today. In terms of planning, you might want to save yourself 50 calories or so for a snack to have in the evening. So there is some evidence, for example, that not long before bed, a kiwi fruit may have some compounds in it that aid sleep. The other thing that a lot of people swear by for insomnia is a milky drink not long before bed. So you can save up some calories for that, or maybe a hot chocolate, a reduced calorie hot chocolate, that can work. Some nuts, very small number, but just enough of those can be very, very satisfying. Those are my bits of advice. Let me know, Kate, how you get on. Finally today, I did say I would talk about the cult of the cauliflower. Since starting on 5'2" and seeing what we're all eating, I have actually begun to wish that I had shares in a cauliflower farm. Now, this very humble white vegetable, often underestimated, is a powerhouse of low-calorie and particularly fast-day cooking, because you can turn it into pretty much anything. Cauliflower, finely grated or processed, makes a fantastic and quick substitute for rice, much, much lower in calories, virtually no carbohydrates at all, and yet it doesn't taste like cauliflower. I've tried it on my boyfriend. He didn't know it was cauliflower, and he doesn't particularly like the vegetable. and it soaks up the sauces really nicely, and you get an extra vegetable as part of your 5 a day. You can also mash it up. Depends what flavourings you add to really make it taste good, but things like mustard can be really good, or a little bit of lower fat cream cheese. You can even make it into pizza. And if you don't believe me, again, there's a recipe in the 5-2 Good Food Kitchen book. It's actually really delicious. It's a gluten-free pizza base, and it's fairly low in calories, but it's really savoury, especially with something like a little bit of blue cheese on the top. I love it. Thanks so much for listening, and incidentally, if you heard the odd squeak or even a trace of a bark in the background, it's the puppy. The next time I'm going to be talking about eating on non-fasting days, how to keep that balance between healthy foods and treats that you'll enjoy but not going overboard. And I'd love it if you could take part. I would really like to hear your question or your tip, and you can record it using a really nifty little webpage called speakpipe.com. The way you do it is you go to www.speakpipe.com/the52diet. That's speakpipe.com/the52diet, and you follow the instructions. Really easy. And as an extra incentive, I'll be giving away a free signed book to one person chosen at random from anyone who leaves a tip or a question by the end of January 2015. Don't forget that for more inspiration on your 5-2 journey, you can read one of my 4 books. For food ideas, success stories, and lots of tips, the kind of things we've been talking about today, there's the Ultimate 5-2 Recipe book and the 5-2 Good Food Kitchen, both available now. For more free tips, recipes and information, visit the 5-2dietbook.com. Follow me on Twitter at the 5-2 Diet, or download free samples of any of the books online at Amazon. Join in the lifestyle change everyone's talking about.